The Tales from the Pizzaplex books have effectively divided the FNaF theorist community. One side believes that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are entirely made up of parallels to the game's timeline, and the other side believes that the books take place within the same universe as the games. I provided my thoughts on the topic multiple times in YouTube shorts, partially related theories, and theory reaction videos, but at this point I feel like it's not enough, and it's important to do a video solely based on the topic of the Tales books. In this video, not only will I be explaining all the reasons why the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are most likely in the games, but I'll also be explaining away all the gripes I've heard people have with it, many of which come from Squawk's recent video on the topic, and some were just ones that people have said to me in the comments of my videos and stuff. So that's what we'll be talking about in today's video. So without further ado, let's get started. Probably the most common reason a lot of people don't think that the Tales stories are in the FNaF game timeline is because supposedly Scott has always said that the books are in a different continuity to the games, and are only parallels. The problem with this argument is that that never actually happened. While the novel trilogy is certainly a different continuity, as Scott confirmed himself, contrary to popular belief, he actually never said that about Fazbear Frights, much less Tales from the Pizzaplex. Instead, what Scott said was that the Fazbear Frights books would look to the past and fill in gaps and answer questions the community has had over the past year at the time. And lo and behold, in Fazbear Frights, we got shown Ultimate Custom Night being displayed as nightmares in the burned corpse of Afton with the spirit of Andrew torturing him. If these books are to be answering questions from what at the time was the past year, and this was 2019, a year after Ultimate Custom Night came out, then wouldn't that mean that he was answering how Ultimate Custom Night worked, and who the one you should not have killed was with these books? That would imply that Andrew is the one you should not have killed, both in the books and in the games, and that would mean that he is in the game's timeline, and if that's the case, then wouldn't the other Stitch Wraith connected stories, or at least some of them depending on what you believe, also be in the game's timeline? As a matter of fact, Scott never actually said that the Frights books weren't in the games. Quite the opposite, in fact. Scott actually said that some of the Frights stories would be directly connected to the games and some wouldn't, and that implies that some Frights stories are in the game's timeline. Furthermore, the Frights books have a lot more direct connections. In Room for One More, Stanley works at Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, the underground facility from Sister Location, and his job is to ensure that nothing gets out, and he also constantly hears banging throughout the story. This directly follows the events of Sister Location, as making sure nothing gets out alludes to the fact that Ennard has already escaped, and Stanley has to make sure that nothing else does. The banging he constantly hears can also be heard in Sister Location when we return from the Circus Gallery control module on night 1. The epilogues also directly follow the events of FNaF 6. The books have very direct connections. Now, whether you believe that's exactly what Scott meant or not is up to you to decide for yourselves, and I've made a whole video on my thoughts about the Frights continuity question, but either way, Scott never said that Frights was an alternate universe. He said at least some were, but he didn't confirm which ones, and he didn't say that they were all in a different continuity. Let me repeat, whether Frights are in the games or not, Scott never said that they weren't. When we look at what he said about Tales though, we get a bit of a different conclusion. See, Scott himself has never actually spoken out directly to us about the Tales from the Pizzaplex books canonicity, but he has actually claimed that they were in the games, even if he didn't tell us directly. In the past, Scholastic has responded to emails that asked about the contents of promotional material, and their response basically said that all promotional material like advertisements or descriptions for the FNaF books were provided by Scott himself. He was the one that told them what to put as the description for Tales from the Pizzaplex. The reason that's important is because the original description for Tales claimed that the stories of the series are in the world of the newest games. No vagueness, no dismissal, no nothing. It just straight up says that they are in the games. You may argue that this description was changed to simply uncharted corners of his series' canon, so that could mean that the books are not meant to be in the games. But when asked about this, Scholastic claimed that the original description still applies, and it wasn't changed for a lore reason but rather a marketing reason. Many people insist that Scholastic doesn't know the lore and only Scott does, and yeah, that's absolutely correct. But Scholastic isn't saying that they know the lore. Instead, they're saying that Scott told them to do something, and they did. Scott told Scholastic to say that Tales was in the game's timeline, and so they did. It's not the word of Scholastic, it's the word of Scott. And even if you for some reason don't want to believe that, let's just take a look at the stories themselves. They match the games to a T. To start off, Somnophobia mentions the attractions Roxy Raceway, Phaser Blast, and Monty Golf, and not all the stories mention the names of these attractions directly, so the story directly mentioning these attractions is definitely worth noting. But yeah, that's just the names of 3 attractions, that's not a whole lot. But what is a whole lot is the story Help Wanted. Help Wanted tells the story of an indie game developer making the in-universe Freddy games, which we learn about in FNaF VR. We first learn about the existence of the indie game developer in the FNaF game FNaF VR Help Wanted, and we get expansion on that character in the Tales from the Pizzaplex story Help Wanted. They're both named Help Wanted because they're linked with each other. They're very clearly meant to be in the same universe. It's not a coincidence, and they perfectly match each other. Another story, Bobby Dots Part 1, describes the Pizzaplex pretty much entirely accurately to what we see in the games. Not only does it mention the game attractions like in Somnophobia, but it also mentions a bunch of extremely specific stuff that we see in Security Breach. First of all, it mentions DJ Music Man and the tunnels that he often climbs through. It has DJ Music Man's experimental bouncer mode mentioned, which is extremely specific as it is only mentioned once in Security Breach, and it even shows that because of this bouncer mode, he looks through the bathroom door and even tries to grab the people inside the bathroom, exactly like what happens in Security Breach. The story also explains the backstory of Sun and Moon. The animatronic was originally a stage performer that had a second personality come out when the lights turned off. When Fazbear Entertainment acquired the animatronic, they adjusted it with Fazbear technology and such, but they couldn't get rid of the alternate personality, and because of the faulty lights in the daycare, they turned it into Sun and Moon. The story specifies that it's possible to fix the animatronic and remove the dual personality, but that would be expensive and just cause more problems for Fazbear Entertainment, which explains how Eclipse exists. Not only that, but the story also mentions how the daycare has 5 generators in the play structures, just like in the games. The Phaser Blast arena is also mentioned along with the alien bots, the capture the flag routine, multiple voice lines from the alien bots that are set in Phaser Blast and Security Breach, as well as the layout of the attraction with the walls with the hieroglyphic looking shapes on it, as well as the winner's elevator which leads to the Superstar Lounge. Everything in this story aligns with the games perfectly. Moving on to GGY, the story obviously tells the story of Patient 46 being Gregory, which is evidence enough, but the story also talks about the appearance of GGY on the games in the arcade, which do appear in Security Breach. The name GGY does appear as the top score overwhelmingly high on the scoreboards on the arcades in Security Breach's arcades. But what's almost more interesting is that the story features a character named Axel who is pretty high on the scoreboard, and his initials are ABC, and wouldn't you know it, ABC is one of the usernames on some of the arcades. Once again, it aligns perfectly. Another point that supposedly goes against Tales being in the games is the fact that there's a lot of locations in the Pizzaplex that we see in Tales but not in Security Breach. But that's essentially the point of Tales. Pretty much all the major locations in Tales from the Pizzaplex are causes of people dying or at the very least something bad happening. Events like these result in these areas getting shut down, and we often see the aftermath of these bad things happening at the locations, like Clethophobia showing the aftermath of under construction with the AR booth blowing up. Also, Clethophobia showing that Balora's Fitness and Flex was supposed to be a thing, but shut down because of Grady dying in it. And also, most importantly, Tiger Rock, where we learn that the Storyteller's tree ends up getting taken down. Locations from Tales not appearing in Security Breach doesn't actually mean anything because the locations are taken down. We also know that the Storyteller's tree actually did exist in the game's timeline. It's basically confirmed at this point through stories like the Storyteller, the Mimic, and the Monty Within, as well as the Help Wanted game in retrospect, that the Glitch Trap virus is the Mimic program, and the Mimic was brought into the Pizzaplex through the Storyteller's tree. The Storyteller's tree in the Storyteller is in the center of the Pizzaplex nearby a castle theater. The reason this is important is because in Princess Quest, on the door leading to Glitch Trap, to the Mimic, we see an image of a tree and castle walls. Glitch Trap, the Mimic, was brought into the Pizzaplex through a tree near a castle in both the games and the Tales books, and that makes it very clear that they are one and the same. All of this stuff matches perfectly with the games, and if it matches that perfectly, then what is even the point of having them be separate universes? It's pretty pointless if it is. Now, that's pretty much all of the big reasons that Tales is most definitely in the games, but there's still a lot of supposed problems that many people have with Tales being in the games, so I wanted to take the time to explain away these issues so that I can hopefully diminish skepticism. As I said at the beginning, many of these points come from Squawk's video on Tales games, so you can check that out if you want to as well. Oftentimes I'm really bad bad at remembering to put things in the descriptions of my videos, but as long as I do remember, his video will be in the description. I should also mention that I know the video isn't saying that Tales Games is wrong and is just explaining why it isn't exactly confirmed. I'm just here to explain away some of the issues he has with it. Plus, there's some problems that people other than SireSquawks have with the theory that I'll also be explaining here. Got it? Cool. So, let's get to that. One thing that was brought up in SireSquawks' video was the fact that in the Storyteller, Chica is described as being yellow with a bib, and she also still has her cupcake acquaintance akin to the earlier versions of Chica. And that is true, but it's not really a huge problem with Tails actually being in the games. It's entirely possible that Chica's design was altered early on in the Pizzaplex era, especially since the Storyteller takes place right at the beginning. It's important to note that in other Tails stories, Chica isn't yellow, doesn't have a bib, and doesn't have a cupcake. Chica in Under Construction is also said to be wearing a pink dress, just like the one we see her wearing in Ruin alongside Foxy. SireSquawks does mention this in his Squawkscast video, but I'm just bringing it up here because I do think it's worth mentioning. Obviously, Chica always wears pink in the Pizzaplex, so it doesn't mean a whole lot, but it's just interesting that she never wears an actual dress in Security Breach, while we do see her with a dress matching how we see her in a Tails story in the same DLC where the Mimic, which was introduced in Tails, shows up. Essentially what I'm saying is just that the pink dress appears in Tails and it appears in the Ruin DLC, which brings more pieces of Tails into the games, which implies that they are meant to be interconnected. Essentially what I'm saying is that while Chica is designed differently in the Storyteller, in other Tails stories, Chica is how she is in Security Breach, implying that either she was altered, which is a bit problematic considering she's colored white in the log ride, which seems to have been before the Pizzaplex even opened, or that if this really was an error, it's less of a problem with Tails being in the games and more of just a problem with the Tails books themselves. That's kind of a trend with some of these issues. The Mr. Hippo magnet being discontinued in Bobby Dots despite still being in the Pizzaplex and Security Breach is absolutely a fair thing to bring up, but I don't think it's exactly major enough to be all that important, and it wouldn't be that hard to just say that the magnet in Security Breach is just an old one, or that they were brought back after being continued or something along those lines, especially since Mr. Hippo was on the front lines to be the replacement in the band for Monty after Monty took Freddy's place. Or, and I know this sounds stupid and it's obviously not what I actually think, but what if it was actually intentionally screwed up? Because it's Mr. Hippo, and Mr. Hippo tells us not to look too deep into things as a way of telling us that a detail this minor doesn't really have to mean anything. Again, probably not, just wanted to bring that up because it's funny. The next problem comes from Epilogue 1, where the Mimic, who has rabbit ears like Bonnie, is thought to be the guitarist, despite the fact that Bonnie is the bass player and Chica is actually the guitarist in the Pizzaplex. But this is easy to explain. What we have to keep in mind is that this is while the Pizzaplex is under construction and before any of the animatronics have performed. Bonnie, throughout Fazbear history, has always been the guitarist, and Chica never has. If nobody has seen how the Glamrocks have performed yet, assuming Bonnie would be the guitarist makes a lot of sense. I'd argue that if he knew that Chica was the guitarist, it would honestly make even less sense. It isn't that the writers didn't know where the Mimic plotline would go, it's that the characters within the story didn't know where both the Mimic and the Pizzaplex storyline in general would go. The Mimic's design in Ruin also isn't problematic if you really think about it. While yes, the design in the books does match Burn Trap in some aspects, it doesn't have to, assuming they're separate. And you can decide for yourselves whether you believe that they're the same or not, but the lack of a shiny head on the Mimic doesn't really mean anything because not only did the Mimic seem to endure a lot in the epilogues, but Ruin is also at least 5 years later, so it wouldn't exactly be shiny anymore by this point anyway. The Mimic also does definitely look burned, or at the very least discolored, as the epilogues actually state, and the corpse thing could be explained in one of two ways. The 8th Tales epilogue has been leaked by now, and I unfortunately did get spoiled for some of it, but what I do not know about it, and I want it to stay that way, commenters, is whether or not Kelly's corpse actually even stuck onto the Mimic. If it actually did, then what we see on Mimic's legs could be flesh, and if it didn't, then it's not, and problem solved. As for the Mimic having ears in the epilogues but not in the games, they could have simply broken off somehow. The rest of the Mimic's design does match perfectly what we see in the books. The Mimic in Ruin does exactly what it did in Tales. It lured someone to a room it was in using a radio by mimicking someone else's voice. When they reached the Mimic, he tried to rip off their limbs and head. Looking at the Mimic's jump scare, it's not absolutely confirmed, but it looks a lot like the Mimic rips off Cassie's arms and then makes Thor proud and goes for the head. And of course there's the obvious fact that both Mimics are bare endoskeletons with white eyes that glow orange, and mimic things. Another thing the Mimic has in the books is the ability to expand and contract and contort to fit into smaller objects. On the Mimic's design in Ruin, we can see that the arms seem to have a sort of collapsing mechanism, which aligns with this ability the Mimic has. Speaking of that ability, it also seems to bother people that the shapeshifted spider Mimic doesn't look like the game Mimic, and while yeah, that is true, it also doesn't look like the book Mimic a lot either. The whole point is that it shapeshifted with different pieces of it switching places and contorting so it can fit inside the costume it was trying to fit inside, an ability that I just mentioned the game Mimic does have. Sure, it's more complicated than it probably should be, but even if we are to say that this is a plot hole, it's again more of a plot hole with the Tales books themselves rather than them being in the games. It's just showing abilities that we know the Mimic has no matter what, so it's not really a problem. Hell, you could even connect this spider form to the game since the Mimic is Glitch Trap, and one of the Glitch Trap enemies in Princess Quest is a spider, so the epilogues do seem to further connect to the games. And that's not even mentioning that the Tales epilogues in the FNaF 6 location under the Pizzaplex directly match what happens in Security Breach. There's also a lion costume that the Mimic wears in the Mimic story that appears in Edwin's factory, and it doesn't match the lion that he wears in Ruin, but it's clearly not meant to be the same one, so I don't think that really means anything. The next point is one that I think is very, very important to clear up, and that is the fact that Henry in FNAF 6 and the Silver Eyes trilogy is heavily implied to have been the one who made the classic animatronics, yet Tales from the Pizzaplex claims that Edwin was the one to do that. This connects into the idea that Edwin is not his own character but is just a parallel to Henry, but that theory really isn't that strong. See, Tales being in the games wouldn't prevent Edwin from being a Henry parallel, but what does prevent Edwin from being a Henry parallel is just a lack of evidence. People claim Edwin to be a Henry parallel due to the fact that both are single fathers of very young children, both build animatronics that act like their children for their children, both of their children die because they were accidentally left outside, and what's left behind is the animatronic that they built for their child continuing to act like the dead child. However, if you really think about it, most of that isn't really true. In the novel trilogy, Henry is not a single father of one young child. He has two children, Charlotte and Sammy, and his wife is still around. When Charlotte dies, Henry is caught up in his grief and finds that his wife and Sammy both leave him. Henry isn't a single father at all because his wife is still around up until after Charlotte dies. Ella also was never supposed to act like Charlotte. The only reason that she did was again because Charlotte died and Henry's anguish infected her. The Mimic likely isn't even powered by agony, as it's mostly just replicating the behaviors of David and Edwin and later Afton. Charlotte did die outside, but that was not an accident. She was forced outside by older kids and then was intentionally murdered by Afton, while David intentionally ran outside and was accidentally hit by a car. Henry also cherishes Ella because she acts like Charlotte, while Edwin hates that the Mimic is acting like David and literally beats the hell out of it. While there's some minor similarities between them, Henry and Edwin are individual characters, and the Mimic was made by Edwin, not Henry. I'm not saying that parallels can't exist at all in the Tales books, I honestly think they do. All I'm saying is that if parallels do exist, I don't think the Henry-Edwin one is one of them. As for Edwin being the creator of the animatronics when other stuff implies that Henry is, that again would not be a problem with Tales being in the games, instead it would just be a problem with Tales itself. See, what a lot of people forget is that the epilogues of Tales literally take place in the burned down FNAF 6 location. FNAF 6 was caused by Henry. Whether Tales is in the games or not, Henry still exists in the Tales universe, meaning whether they parallel each other or not, no matter what, Henry and Edwin are individual characters. Edwin doesn't replace Henry at all. Henry exists, so if Henry did build the classic animatronics, that's just a continuity error within Tales itself and not just the games, meaning it doesn't contradict specifically the games but itself too. And therefore, it being in the games wouldn't create any extra plot holes. Plus, with the recent idea of the classics being made from costumes that were at Fredbear's, which I talked about in a recent video that you should definitely check out if you haven't yet, Henry probably made those costumes, and he was also the ones to make the Springlock suits. He could have also created the original classics and their blueprints and just given them to Edwin to make more of them for other Freddy's locations, meaning that Henry would still be the creator and there wouldn't be any plot holes to begin with. This argument is understandably questioned due to the fact that Edwin is one man, so why not mass produce them rather than just make Edwin do everything, but the timeline placement of the Mimic is important to consider. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opened in 1983, meaning the animatronics were created in 1983, but the Mimic story takes place in 1984, which we know due to the fact that Security Breach can't be any later than 2027 since Edwin is making animatronics for Fazbear Entertainment, and the latest that can happen is 1987 as that's the last time new animatronics had to be made, and the timeline with Edwin's company wouldn't add up otherwise. It's already a bit wonky, but pushing it further in the future just makes it impossible to play out the way it did. The Storyteller is 40 years after the Mimic, and if the Mimic was in 1987, the latest it could be, that would place the opening of the Pizzaplex in 2027, which doesn't work because of the Fazlife magazines, which are quarterly. Quarterly means that there would be 4 every year, and since there's 19, that means that by the time of Security Breach, the Pizzaplex has been open for just under 5 years. 2032, 5 years after 2027, doesn't match the calendar in Security Breach, which therefore means that Security Breach is in 2029, and that means that the Pizzaplex opened in 2024. And 40 years before that is 1984, which places the Mimic story in 1984. That's too late for him to be making the original animatronics because Freddy's opened in 1983, as I said, so him making duplicates is pretty much undeniable, as weird as it is. As I said, it's not really a plot hole with Tails being in the games. If anything, it's a plot hole with Tails itself, but even that it probably isn't, because there's another option that makes a lot of sense. It seems implied that after the death of Charlotte, Henry left Fazbear Entertainment, and since he made the original animatronics, his designs for them probably couldn't be replicated again. So therefore, since Fazbear Entertainment had bought Edwin's company, they made him recreate the animatronics as similarly as possible to the ones that Henry made, using the costumes and turning them into animatronics just like Henry did, making new models of the original gang. The ones we face off against in FNAFs 1 and 2 are the original ones that Henry made in the restaurants in Hurricane, Utah, but some of the many other Freddy's locations have recreations made by Edwin to replicate Henry's designs, and then those Edwin designs were mass produced for those other Freddy's locations. Hell, it's kind of poetic in a way, as Edwin was the creator of the Mimic endoskeleton and he was the one mimicking Henry's work. It kind of makes sense, and I think that idea works well. But all of this also brings another supposed problem to the table, the timeline placement. How could the Pizzaplex possibly open only under a year after FNAF 6? But once again, as I keep saying, that's not a problem with Tails games. If anything, it's just a problem with Tails. Because remember, FNAF 6 still happened in the Tails universe, whether it's the same universe as the games or not. So even if that was a problem, which by the way can be solved by just having a bunch of really efficient workers, but it wouldn't be a problem with Tails being in the games. That's honestly just a big trend here. Many of the supposed inconsistencies with Tails being in the games are just supposed inconsistencies within the Tails stories themselves, and all of them have their own explanations, so they're probably not inconsistencies at all. Could they be? Maybe, but the point is that they don't have to be. If they can be explained away easily, then it's not really amazing evidence. And finally, there's the question of why the Mimic is always represented by a tiger in Tails, but a lion and a rabbit in the games. But that's also easy to explain. The Mimic's origins in the games connect to a tiger too. He wouldn't wear a tiger in Ruin because he can only wear costumes that he has access to under the Pizzaplex. There's no tiger costume under there. It's as simple as that. And the difference between the Glitch Trap Mimic Rabbit persona and the Tiger Rock Mimic Tiger persona is that there's multiple different pieces of the Mimic program. One piece of the program was used for the Pizzaplex and another for the VR game. The one for the VR game learned about William Afton's murders and began mimicking him, but the one in the Pizzaplex hadn't learned about him yet. With the help of Gregory, the Glitch Trap virus, the part of the Mimic program that did learn about Afton and began mimicking him, was merged with the Tiger one, as we know from the fact that GGY and the Storyteller's Tree both hack the animatronics with the Mimic, but in 2 different ways. The Mimic in the games and the books are the same Mimic, and the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, at least in my opinion, are definitely in the games. But all I've done here is lay out all the information. The actual conclusion is up for you guys to decide. You don't have to agree with me here. You can form your own opinions on whether or not Tails is in the games. I'm just here to explain why I think that they are and explain some of the problems that people have with it. And I think I'm satisfied with my conclusion on the topic, and I probably won't tackle it for a while. So if in future videos, such as theory reactions or otherwise, I have to explain that I disagree because of Tails games, I'm not going to explain myself over and over again. Because now, finally, I have all the evidence and defenses right here in this video that I can cite from now on. But that's everything that there is to talk about in this video. Let me know in the comments what you guys think and if you agree with me that Tails is in the games. If you do, let me know why, and if you don't, also let me know why. Either way, I probably won't reply, but just know that I definitely saw your comment. I always do. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to. And my next theory will be about the Tails story Help Wanted and how the reveal in that story goes a lot deeper than we thought now that we have a lot more information, and that'll probably be out in a couple days. Tomorrow's actually my birthday, birthday, so I'll be doing a different kind of video tomorrow where I play some VR games because I got a PSVR 2. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned for tomorrow. And either way, stay tuned for all my upcoming theories. But that's all, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye, guys!